Welcome everyone. My name is David Pipe. I'm the Artistic Director of the Leeds International Organ Festival. And just before we begin, just to give a bit of a background as to how that fits in our music programme. So the Diocese of Leeds Music is made up of several components. The biggest really at the moment is our school singing programme. So that involves about 4,500 children each week who are seen in class singing sessions, after school sessions, and that makes up the bulk of our after school choirs. So the Leeds Cathedral choirs, for example, Bradford, Huddersfield, and so on. The singing is about to be expanded into a national school singing programme. So that's aiming to get into every diocese, every Catholic diocese within the country. And on home territory, we'll be offering this to all the 89 schools within the Diocese of Leeds. My part of this, I run the keyboard studies programme, and we're now offering organ, piano and accordion lessons to children all over the diocese, and soon to start whole class instrumental tuition on melodeon. It's worth saying we're terribly grateful to the Liz and Terry Bramall Foundation for their generous support, which has allowed us to give bursaries to children who otherwise couldn't have these lessons. And I'm delighted that Dr. Bramall's here with us this evening. Also thanks are due to the Royal College of Organists, who very kindly supported this event. And I think we'll probably hear about them a bit later. Judith's linked to them through her medal and so on. We're going to record this. In fact, we are recording already for a broadcast on YouTube, our Organ Festival YouTube channel next week on the 15th of June. So just leaves me really to welcome very warmly Judith Weir, wonderfully titled Master of the Queen's Music, and our old friend Richard Mantle, who is the General Director of Opera North. So I'm going to switch my video off and hand over to you both. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and it's great to be with you. I'm sorry we're not with you in person, it was like 2 years ago that we did a similar event there in the cathedral in Leeds. But I'm absolutely delighted to be joined here with Judith Weir. For me, one of the United Kingdom's leading and most prolific composers of our time. And as David just said, as currently the Master of the Queen's Music. I'm sorry you don't have a uniform for that, but I'm sure you can tell us about the uniform later, Judith. And as it happens, Judith and I go back really quite a long way. We probably don't want to admit to how long ago it was, but it was some 30 years ago when I was director of Scottish Opera in Glasgow that I commissioned, and we realized Judith's very Scottish opera called The Vanishing Bridegroom, which received its premiere in Glasgow in 1990, which I think was the city of culture for the city way back then. So, and it was a terrific success. And it was one of the first times that I had personally worked and collaborated with a composer on such a venture. And I can tell you now, and I remember it very vividly. It was a very joyous and a hugely instructive experience for me. I mean, largely thanks to Judith's fantastic collaborative spirit and her really wanting to achieve the best for everybody, not just the performers, not just for the piece, but for the audience. And I was always very conscious of that. And what I'll say, her cool and sometimes understated demeanor concealed, I can tell you, quite a steely determination to realize her work and such distinctive work it was. But we're here to hear something about Judith. As you all know, Judith's music has been a very important part of her life from a very early age. And I believe that through her output, whether that's instrumental, including, dare I say, the organ, which we'll come back to, vocal, choral, or opera, I want to say that I think she's one of the great architects of contemporary music in Britain, ranking alongside, the greats of Britten, Tippett, Turnage, and there will be others, but we can't list them all, and that list is not that long. And Judith, for me, you're absolutely up there with one of them. Now I'm an opera man, as you know, and I've taken a great interest in Judith's operatic work, and for me, it seems to sit centre stage in what she has composed over so many years. And we might come to talk about opera a little bit later. And those of you who know her music, and it is very varied, and I think that's one of the things we'd like to hear about this evening. But I've always felt that it had such a characteristic sort of ebullience, luminosity, ingenuity, and colour, which has always for me made her music and her work such a compelling listen. So that's the adulation, Judith. So that's where that'll end now. So, but so on we go. But I thought we could start. It's rather obvious in a sense. You know, at the beginning, really. You know, how did music come to play such an important part in your life? We know that you studied under John Tavener, Robin Holloway, very distinguished people. But who was your inspiration? And did you at some point have what you might say a sort of dampening experience to become a composer, or was this a sort of a natural progression to where things took?
Well, by the way, I just have to say thank you for that wonderful introduction, and indeed we can revisit some of the work that we did 30 years ago later on. Yes, I wish I had a better answer to the first question that you've posed, because definitely there was no big intention to become a composer. Compared with a lot of the young people that I see these days in music education, for instance, some of these impressive people in the specialist music schools or the music colleges, I was nothing like that. We used to enjoy music at home. My parents both came from the north of Scotland and had a kind of do-it-yourself attitude to music. Didn't have to be played that well, but the idea was to get together and play it now and again. So I suppose that might be one ingredient in the idea of seeing people just sitting down and playing some music any old how. And I had I would say, fairly normal education, primary and secondary. My secondary school wasn't big on music at the time, but we did have, in the end, one good music teacher, and it was she who knew John Tavener, who lived nearby to our school, up in the sort of western fringes of London in Wembley. So that was just a stroke of good luck. And I used to occasionally take some music round after school to show to him. How I got to writing that music, again, is very informal. I think through my dad, who'd played in jazz bands and things, I got that idea of getting bands together at school mostly, but they were very weirdly instrumented bands. You know, we certainly didn't have a full range of anything. So I started arranging music first for that group.
But you were a musician yourself. You played instrument, I think.
I played, again, that lucky generation, I got an oboe at school. There was one, the school lent it to me. And latterly, in the sixth form, I had a very good teacher, Robin Miller, now dead, but played in the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. People will remember him. And eventually, I was able to get into the National Youth Orchestra. That was a real turning point for me, because, you know, there were some fantastic musicians there. But it was very informal, and just eventually I decided to do a music degree. I was not thinking, oh, and after all that, I'll become a composer. But as the time went by, I found that I was doing more composing than anything else. And fortunate at that time, I think that there were quite a lot of avenues for beginner composers, people to send your music away to, that you might get a workshop or a run through. I suppose those things exist in different forms now, but anyway, that's how things started to happen.
And from then on and through university, and obviously Robin Holloway must have been quite a big influence on you, I would have thought, at that stage.
Again, that's difficult to explain. I went to Cambridge, and I really went because lots of my friends in the National Youth Orchestra went on there, and I thought, God, it must be really good. In fact, in those days, and this is a long time ago, it was a very sleepy, I would have to say, rather uninteresting course. We did and this is good, I realize now, a lot of harmony and counterpoint and fugues, that has helped me as it has turned out. But there wasn't really anybody teaching composition there. Robin was, I think he was some kind of, maybe he was done a PhD or something. Anyway, he was very unofficial, but he kindly did give me some lessons. I've actually got to know him a lot better in the years since then. And in a sense, the influence, not so much directly from the music he writes, but just he's such an impressive figure culturally. His knowledge is incredible of the history of music, particularly from the 19th century onwards, but also art and literature. And somehow just to experience that, it's an inspiration, certainly.
Yeah. And were there composers at that time that were really sort of switching on your lights and giving you some sort of sense of inspiration to, well, not emulate them, of course, I don't think that's what anybody would do, but that really spoke to you through their music?
Well, I would have to say the basic composer to me was Stravinsky, and perhaps is Stravinsky, although I don't listen to him quite so much. A particular thing I remember from my 3 years in the National Youth Orchestra, was playing Stravinsky's symphonies of wind instruments. So pieces like that I don't think are played every day, but they really went in at a granular level. Funnily enough, I think now the only work that we hear of Stravinsky regularly are the big ballet scores, and why not? Aren't they marvelous?
Yeah, they're fantastic. Yes.
There's so much else, and indeed a lot of those rather windy chamber pieces, the septet, the octet, and so on. So I think if I had to say a composer that showed me a way that I might progress, it's him. There were obviously always lots of other composers. It was still the great period of the post-war avant-garde. We're talking about people like Stockhausen and Boulez. And I think out of that group of composers, the one I most enjoyed was Luciano Berio. His music was so lyrical, much more lyrical than those other guys. And I think he also was a great influence at that time.
Well, I think I hear a lot of lyricism in your music, so I'm sure that's had an immense effect. And we'll come perhaps back onto some of that a bit later on. But I'd just like to ask you about your ancient and royal office as the master of the Queen's music. I'm glad we've always kept the gender balance going here, haven't we? But I'm sure we can't call it we can't dare call it anything else.
Yes.
I'm sure nobody would have that. And I confess, in a layman in this really, I've always just thought that the Master of the Queen's music sort of tipped up and wrote something for a state occasion, and I know that they do, and I know that you have. But there must, I would hope, to be much more to it. And I'm wondering whether you get quite a lot of leeway in what you might do in that role, or what you would have liked to have done in the role. I think it's a fixed term now. I think it's a 10-year time, and you've got about 3 years to still about 3 years to go. So, I mean, it would be interesting to hear how you've perhaps approached that role. Perhaps it could be different to any of your predecessors, and what you might try and achieve out of it before you pass over the baton or whatever it is to somebody else.
Yes, well, indeed, I think almost no one knows what this is. I think we even once asked the Queen, who similarly, it's something that's been around for almost 400 years. She is certainly not one to rebrand these court appointments, and it has changed a lot. It started off as someone who got an orchestra together for Charles I, but in the last 100 years or so, I guess it's been composers, most notably Elgar and my predecessor, Peter Maxwell Davies. So as you say, I would say in normal times, maybe once a year, something comes up at some big event or other. I have very happy memories of the 4 years that we spent commemorating the First World War kind of year by year, and there were some fantastic occasions on which occasionally I contributed music to that. But otherwise, and it is a spare time appointment, as it were, nobody's expecting you to do this all the time, but it gave me the chance to choose a few priorities which were, I felt, staring me in the face of groups of people really that I wanted to encourage and if and when give a bit of royal approval to. Absolutely top of my list was school music teachers, because firstly I had learnt so much from mine, but also, as we know, in the last decade, music in schools has been under particular threat because of changes to the curriculum. And so if I do one thing, it's to try and persuade schools to keep their music teacher or to get a new one. Not so much because I want everyone in the school to study GCSE or A-level music. That would be great if they did, but it's just because I think a school needs some music, and schools are so pressurized these days anyway.
It's incredible, you know, even in Leeds here. I mean, we are now working with about 6 or 7 schools in the centre of Leeds, primary age children, and we teach every single child in the school, about 2,000 a week, to sing or to play something as part of their curriculum. But that's a sort of pinprick, really, of what, you know, is lost in Leeds. I mean, certainly I'm talking about Leeds, but it's true of any part of the country, really, that you know, music for a lot of these schools is non-existent, really. So maybe we'll have to get you to bang a big drum as the master of the Queen's music at the government to say this has got to change, or something like that.
Well, goodness, you know, I and many people are doing, I'm sure you too, Richard, this drum banging. We're in such a strange situation at the moment, but I think even whatever we can do, it's important that we keep doing it. And so that really is top of my list. I also look around at what's going on, and I try to encourage those groups of people who we would never read about in, say, a music review, but they definitely are keeping music going in our country. Things like amateur orchestras. I'm very touched by the way that they meet up every week. Some of them are very good. Some of them don't give such spectacular performances, but they're very, very important in people's lives. And if we didn't realize that before, we certainly have realized it during the pandemic when this hasn't been able to happen. And of course, allied to that, amateur choirs. We understand that there are over 2 million people who sing in choirs in this country. I feel in a way the choral movement is more of a movement. It doesn't need to be pointed out quite so much, but some of these...
Well, it's probably the most accessible somehow, isn't it?
Yes,
you know, to be in an orchestra, you've probably got to be able to play an instrument. To sing in a choir, most people can sing somehow, and I think it's a more participatory thing. But that might just perhaps bring me on to the fact that I'm interested to see the spread of the way your work has developed over the years. And there was an awful lot of opera a while ago, and there's been slightly less more recently, because you've devoted quite a lot of time to instrumental music and choral music. I think of a great variety. And I suspect, do you think this has been part of your response to this sense of continuing interest in choral work?
Do you mean the post of Master of the Queen's Music?
No, just you as a composer, really.
Yes, I see. Well, I think really it's the voice and vocal music that has shown itself, strangely enough, because I wasn't a singer ever myself, but I suppose when it comes down to it, it is the most expressive part, I think, of music. And when you meet singers, I mean, when I think of the professional singers I've worked with, indeed opera singers, they are such extraordinary people because they embody their instrument. They are their musical instrument. They just give everything. And I suppose my work has increasingly become a response to that. But I also see social importance in choral singing, these big groups of people who again regularly get together. And so that also has been an important factor in it, I think.
And you think that that's going to be obviously a continuing interest, I think, for you, I would think, as a composer going forward?
I suppose too. I really take things as they come. I try to have a varied diet. As you've mentioned, the last opera was about 10 years ago now, and certainly during the period that I've done as Master of the Queen's Music, I think simply to get the time to write another opera would have been very difficult. But it's still an interest of mine, and you know, I suppose a wish would be to do one in the future. But I think
oh,
yes,
don't tell me that.
Shock horror.
Shock horror, another one coming up.
But certainly choral music seems to happen quite naturally. It's amazing how I finish a choral piece and somehow an important reason to write another one arrives the next day.
And you tend to write these choral pieces for particular choral groups, or do you just think this is a piece I want to, you know, sort of create?
I think choral music almost has to be for specific groups. That's an interesting part of the choral world, that all the choirs are different, really, and some of them are very different from each other. Something I'm going to do later in the year is to write for a trainee choir of young people, which is just sopranos, altos, and a low part for teenage boys. Each one of them has a different specification, and again, that's very different from orchestral music, which I do still enjoy writing when I get the chance. But there's something, again, predictable in a good sense about what it's like to work for an orchestra. There's a lot of stuff you can expect, but choirs are all different, and I think that therein lies the interest.
Well, as we are here at the Leeds International Organ Festival, and I think supported by the Royal College of Organists, so we should be grateful to them. And I think it's, I'm correct in saying you received the RCO medal. I think it was last year, I think. I don't know why people get the medal. I'm sure you're about to tell us why you got the medal. Maybe not for your organ playing. I don't know how good that, although that is, but you have written for the organ. I was interested to, and I'm certain, and I know there are some organists sitting on this event this evening. That it always seems to me, writing for an organ, one almost ought to be able to, obviously not, but obviously be able to play it. And I just wonder, how do you sort of approach the writing of for a mighty organ, like said one, and even in Leeds Cathedral, or even in Leeds Town Hall, which I think is a huge thing. How does that happen?
Well, this is a very good question, and I feel a certain amount of guilt because I had a few organ lessons when I was just before I was a student, almost just to find out what the thing was about. I certainly can't play it. And I would also add that I don't really understand how it works even now. The interesting thing here, and the wonderful thing, is that once again, all organs are different, but it's the performers who take a very big role in working out how your notes will be distributed amongst whatever stops and manuals they have. And that seems to me a very interesting component of the whole thing, that the performer actually plays an enormous creative role. And when I started off, I wrote a couple of organ works, actually, for one of our students from Glasgow University, where I used to teach, Michael Bonaventure. And in a way, he really created those pieces for me by so creatively finding stops that would make the piece as exciting as possible. And through having written those, as I say, just 2 or 3 pieces, organists knew a little bit about my work. These pieces became published, and although they're very difficult to play, I would think, they did get some performances. So in more recent years, I've returned to the organ to write for it again, and I quite like to include it in choral music. it's just very exciting and a very useful resource.
Very colourful and
yes, exactly. But I would also add, I was speaking about the groups of people who I like to champion as part of Master of the Queen's Music. And to my surprise, a group which has entered that is the group of organists in this country, because I think they do an incredibly important job, once again, of keeping music going, particularly in perhaps rural, non-urban places where your local organist might be your only source of music. A lot of people learn whatever they do know of music, reading music, in church choirs. And so I have felt that this is a really important group of people. Again, often not speaking up for themselves, not known generally, but very virtuosic players on the whole. And you've mentioned the Royal College of Organists, again, a rather admirable college in that they don't anymore have premises of their own. They kind of exist all over the place, but they run, as is well known, probably the most difficult set of music exams in existence. And in a sense, they are keeping a certain branch of very important education going. So although I've got nothing in a way to do with the organ at all, I find myself very much drawn to it because of the important job that is done.
And have you been, I think, is it right that you've been working with the RCO in the sort of composition competitions and that sort of thing?
Yes, indeed. We did really quite a big composition award. Now, I think I'm losing all track of the time in the COVID era, but I think that was about a year ago. I had the honor of being one of the judges alongside two distinguished organists, and many entries came in for this. And we had a real, again, online, alas not live, but we had weeks and weeks of really interesting discussion. Very complicated thoughts went on. And as a result of this, a couple of winners were eventually chosen. And bless the RCO, they have actually published these two works. My memory is going today, so I can't exactly, I know that the senior award was run by Paul Trepty, and I'm so sorry to say I've forgotten the younger man who won the kind of junior award, a very nice piece. But that was a really good enterprise, and I guess it will happen again one of these days.
No, well, it's all terrific, really, and long may that continue. You mentioned the pandemic and all of that. I'd like to come back to that a bit later on, really, because I think there are some big issues for music as a result of all that we've gone through in the last times. But I think it's time. Can I just come back to opera now for a moment? Anyway, that would be, I'd love to say that. I think I'm correct in saying that one of your very first published operatic compositions was almost an antithesis to what people normally regard of what an opera is. And some of you will probably know this on this call, but King Harold's Saga, which we performed not so long ago in our space here in Leeds, is an unaccompanied piece, I think, has 8 characters. It's performed by one person and it lasts all of 10 minutes. That sounds to me like almost a perfect opera sometimes, something
Yes.
you did through. But I mean, but obviously you didn't stop there, and your content of operatic work and music theatre has become very rich. But you know, was Harold a bit of a turnkey for you in treading down this musical theatre operatic work?
Well, I'm so touched that you should mention King Harold's Saga today, because the person who I wrote it for, Jane Manning, died a couple of months ago. I attended this afternoon her funeral, a very touching event. Heavens. So it's absolutely fantastic that, and typical of her actually, that we should be talking about this piece, which she must have performed, I think, 1,000 times around the world over about 40 years. And now many, to my surprise, and I didn't know about your performance, but it's very difficult, but a lot of young singers have taken it on since. And I think you're absolutely right. If I had not met Jane Manning, if I'd not written that piece for her, if she hadn't done these absolutely mad performances all over the world, I'm not sure I would have proceeded with the idea of writing opera, and certainly not devising my own stories and libretti, doing the research in that area. So I think you're absolutely right. It was the key to working in this area. And in a way, the key to working with professional singers too, because she was such a character, as have been so many of the people since that I've worked with, particularly in opera companies.
Yeah. I mean, I reflect quite a lot on your operatic output. And sometimes we listen to composers, don't we? And we think, oh yes, that's all by Benjamin Britten, and that's all by Richard Strauss or whatever. I'm not sure that's always true about you, because there's such a variety in the way you've approached writing opera, both the sort of tonal worlds you create, the stories, the narratives that you develop or you rely on, and you seem to occupy a very sort of exotic world. In the case of The Vanishing Bridegroom, which obviously you and I were involved in, there was an opera based on some sort of supernatural Hebridean folk tales, or there's the hugely ingenious A Night at the Chinese Opera, which had another extraordinary narrative, and again a completely different sort of tonality. How do you, it would be interesting, I think, for all of us to hear how you sort of develop the idea of an opera. Is that something that you conjure up, or you suddenly find it in a book, or obviously companies commission you as well, I understand that. But how does that process really work for you?
In a way, I wish I knew. I think I could get there much quicker if I had any idea. I often say that to even contemplate doing an opera, and I think all other composers, you have to be super interested in the subject, and that means probably immersion over a matter of years in the subject matter. And so in each of the things you've mentioned, that was the case. Thinking about The Vanishing Bridegroom, I mean, that's a sort of lifelong interest in Scottish folk material, and indeed the music. The opera after that, Blonde Egbert, I just had a indeed, and I just this weekend had a fantastic performance in the Amsterdam Concertgebouw. Again, I had to just sit watching it on my computer screen, but that is very much influenced by the sort of Der Freischütz up to Wagner, kind of German romanticism, but also, yes, expressionism at the same time. So I'm certainly the first to admit I borrow a lot from other musical traditions, and perhaps through immersing myself in the subject matter, naturally the musical subject matter bears the imprint of that.
And it's interesting that sometimes you've been your own librettist, and other times you are not. Are you more comfortable as being writing your own libretto as well, or it's probably there's obviously the collaborative opportunity to work with.
Yes, I think I started off writing my own libretti just somehow to get the pieces written quickly. That was certainly the case with King Harold's Saga, and I should say in most of these cases I was editing an original ancient source. That would be the case also with The Vanishing Bridegroom and Blonde Egbert. So that's in a way as far as I feel comfortable. This will be very well known to you, but it's a problem finding librettists who really know the opera world. And then it's a problem reaching an agreement, perhaps with such a person, about what you want to write about. What is it going to be about? How will you do that? So it's never comfortable in a way. I'm very, very aware that I'm not a writer, I'm a composer. And as you say, the collaborative opportunity is there. And I certainly always set poetry by other people. I have a very big piece called Woman Life Song. It was commissioned by Jesse Norman, and that was collaboration with three major American writers. So that is all very interesting, but it's by no means easy to to get that done.
No, it's fascinating, really. I might just say at this point that if anybody does want to ask a question of Judith, I think you can use the Q&A button or the chat button down below, and someone else will perhaps field that. So if you've got anybody got a question that you'd like to put to Judith, we've got one or two more things to discuss, and then we'll wrap up and give a chance for questions. So please send in your questions. One thing I always love to ask, well, I don't ask it very often, of course. You know, composers, you write pieces, you often write them, as you say, for a particular performer, a group of performers, or under a commission. But then they get interpreted, and particularly in opera certainly, don't we know it, does get interpreted, and certainly in the sort of more classic world of the 19th century and back, you know, directors can have a field day. It seems to be less so with more contemporary work, just partly because I think there's more of a sensibility around it. You know, I'm also very aware that some composers, particularly more contemporary composers, go to enormous lengths to, you know, specify the style or provide very precise instructions for how their music should be expressed. And then, of course, that may not happen. Now, I don't know whether how precise you demand things to be, and in some ways, it's probably quite good that you don't, because, you know, expression seems to me very, very important. But I don't know how you feel about. Do you feel completely at sea, or when someone else has taken on the work to perform or express it?
Well, I think the whole subject of opera productions is perhaps something to lay on one side.
For another day, I think. Yes.
Yes, or maybe quite a few days, because yes, that's really, as you say, that really is something else. The way that I think some directors see it as their role to come along from a completely different direction and do something so unexpected that it's completely contrary, in fact, to tradition. But thinking about instrumental and vocal works, the sort of bread and butter of what I write and what composers write, I think in general that's one of the wonderful things, if you're lucky enough to have works which stand a bit of the test of time. In other words, if you can hear them 20, 30, 40 years after you wrote them, that's the excitement really of rediscovering them, hearing them anew. There are obviously things that I don't like to hear. Sometimes tempi can be shocking. I think even though I tend, and I think most people these days tend to put up quite clear metronome markings on the scores, you could sometimes be quite shocked by a tempo, either too slow or too fast. But then sometimes somebody does that and it's perfect. So it's very hard to tell what's wrong and what's right. But I would say
there have been pieces. Sorry, go on, carry on.
No, carry on. That's really all I was going to say. I think on the whole, that's the advantage of classical music being written down. Then performers come along with different sensibilities.
And I was going to ask whether you felt that there's a piece that you've written, whatever it is, that's sort of not been improved, but taken to a different place by a particular performer that really enabled the piece perhaps to grow further than you might have expected. Maybe not, I don't know.
I think what I notice, and it's more about me than the music or the performers, but coming back to a piece after quite a few years, sometimes it's not so good. You think, what on earth was that? I'm sometimes puzzled by some of my old pieces that I haven't heard for a long time. But conversely, you approach this piece, which is almost an out-of-body experience. You're able at last to come away from your own anxieties and tensions and worries that surrounded the first performance, as they often do. And that's one of the greatest pleasures, to hear an old piece sounding better than you expected. So there's no particular example. I mean, I will give you one. I spent some years as a resident composer with the CBSO and wrote 3 or 4 orchestral works. And yeah, it was hard work getting those orchestral works written, and sometimes the great pleasure, Simon Rattle was still there and all that. But I remember it as sometimes thinking, oh, that didn't go so well. And I can remember to prom, I suppose this must be 2 years ago, it's the last time we had normal proms, just almost by chance, Zachary Oromo conducting one of these scores, it's called Forest, and it just went off so well. I sat there so calmly listening to this work, which I could hardly remember having written, and just what a pleasure that was. So those are the things that really make it worthwhile.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm conscious of time, because I think we were supposed to be talking for 45 minutes or half an hour. We're nearly on 40 now already. But I'd just like to perhaps bring us back to, to now and our times now, which have been such a challenge for so many people over the last 15 months. But there are a couple of things I wanted to touch on. Obviously, during this last period, live performance has hardly happened. It is great that some live performance is just beginning to happen again now, and I'll put my advertisement in that tomorrow night in Leeds Town Hall, Opera North will be performing Fidelio in front of a live audience, and it's our first live performance of an opera since the 15th of March last year, not even this year. So it's an incredible, and the buzz in the company, I can tell you, is enormous. And of course, a lot of performance and expression has all moved online in all sorts of digital ways. And that's, I think, been fascinating. It's been interesting. From our point of view, we've learned huge amounts how we can communicate online. Some of that has been a great plus, and some of it probably hasn't. But I wonder, from your perspective, as obviously a consummate musician and composer, apart from obviously losing live performance, going out online, what are we losing? But at the same time, what have we learned as well? And do you think that we're a bit in danger of perhaps a live experience being sort of, redacted a bit back onto our iPhones or our iPads?
Well, to take the last bit first, I definitely don't think we're in danger of that, because I think everybody who loves music is anxious, thirsty for the live experience. I've just been in the last week to a local festival, the Hertfordshire Festival, and live performances, and just hearing people around me, the pleasure that they're getting. Not just from the music, but the ritual of turning up, going to the concert, seeing other people, maybe meeting the performers afterwards. So I think, if anything, it's strengthened our enthusiasm for those things, reminded us why it's so important to do these things. I think I have to say, particularly in a field like contemporary music, we have noticed some very useful things about the live streaming world. Certain events which you wouldn't perhaps expect to get a very good audience for, or not a very big one, you can gather people from all over the country who can see via live stream perhaps the premiere of a new work, or to discuss it. I've been in some very interesting new music discussions, which just couldn't have happened. We couldn't have got all those people to London or Leeds or Edinburgh at the same time. So I feel sure that will continue. I think, above all, the thing I've learned is that we don't necessarily, in our live contacts with music, pick up the things we think we're going to. Going to a live rehearsal, you would think that's all about listening to the rehearsal and every single note, looking at the score. I've learned that what I most get from it are those little conversations at the end, or round the back, or in the coffee queue, or something like that. It's those things that really fire my imagination and my inspiration. And I've found it a very dead period, I have to say, the 15 months. I've been busy, very busy, doing a lot on Zoom. I have continued with composing. Thank goodness I've had a lot of tasks to do. But actually, it's only been in those short periods so far, when there's been live music, that I've really got the buzz back about music. So I think there's no question that.
Yeah. No, well, on that, I think we can be both absolutely agreed, and that's what we're going to be about. You mentioned much earlier about sort of social impact of music, I think, briefly in one of the things you were saying. And that, you know, we're hopefully, we hope, coming out of a time that's been very challenging for a lot of people individually, you know, a lot of isolation, the lack of what can we call it, community experience, issues around mental health for young people, for older people, huge loss of opportunity at school, academic achievement for young people. What would you say can be, I think, the role of music in sort of, without sounding overground about this, you know, rebuilding our society and our communities?
Well, I think probably it's some of the things we've been talking about this evening. Firstly, that above all, a musical performance underlines that communality of everyone coming to a performance space at the same time, a large number of people taking part either as listeners or performers. So we can genuinely say that we are about live events and the community and drawing people together, drawing their focus together. I think what you say absolutely about the disruption in education, of all the things that worries me absolutely the most. I am always hoping there will be an opportunity for music to re-enter schools in a big way. And I would like to think one of the things we have learned again about the last school year is the importance just of these refreshing breaths of fresh air that music can bring, that it just isn't all about endless mock exams, mock GCSEs, if for the clever people, but just that whole metric approach to education. So music absolutely is at the top of the list as something that could help in that respect. I would also just say that anyone who does music, who's learnt an instrument or belongs to a choir, we don't lose that. It's just because we couldn't do it for 15 months, it's remarkable. We want to do it twice as much. It's not some stupid hobby that we lay aside. It's really something fundamental. So I think that is our strength as music people.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I've got one other thing to sort of pose with you, but one or two people have put in some questions, and maybe I can just pick up one or two questions that people have raised, and one of them might have been something I would have raised actually, but the question goes like this. You mentioned the challenge of music in schools. Is it a challenge writing music for normal children in state schools, given the huge reductions that have taken place in music in the state sector? And, capital letters, do you think classical music remains more than ever the province of the social elite? There we go.
Wow. Well,
I won't tell you asked the question, but we both know it. Anyway.
that might take quite a long time to talk about. Well, I just personally, when I go into any school, whatever kind of school it is, we've talked about every choir is different, every organ is different, every school is different, really. You don't know what you're going to find. And as a composer, I always find it a challenge, whatever it is. In a sense, I rather enjoy going into, I don't want schools to have very few musical resources, but it's certainly a great way to start a lesson or a project, starting from the ground up, having to, as it were, invent your resources. I've had some very enjoyable projects of that kind. Now, as for classical music, what part it can play, again, as a composer, I start from the ground up. I'm not particularly thinking I'm classical. I'm thinking about myself as somebody who creates melodies and chords and rhythms. And that's definitely the way I would play it in any educational situation. That's not so easy for the poor teachers who very often, as soon as they get near a public exam, it's these days particularly the very crowded curriculums in those public exams, and a lot of music has to be examined and learnt. It's, as it were, not my problem as a composer working in a school. I've seen some great teachers and some great projects in schools, which is, as well as doing all sorts of music, pop music, jazz, music from around the world, classical music also takes its place. I think we have to anyway recognize in the musical universe now that classical music is just one of the many musics that happens. Even something like the proms, it seems to me, is going more and more in that direction. That may be upsetting for some music lovers, and indeed I would hate for classic music to be diluted or pushed to the corner. But I don't see the situation in any way as being hopeless.
No, well, that's very reassuring. There are a couple of questions about organ. I'm sure they probably come both, well, one of the questions does come from an organist. I don't know about the other one, but they're both about the organ. So I'll put them both together and I hope that you can pick it all up. The first one is, when you write music for the organ, do you view the instrument as a keyboard capable of colors or in a more orchestral manner? That's the first point. And the next one is from an organist. I'm interested to what extent your organ music has been composed collaboratively with a specified organist, specific organist. And that might be true also, I think you did say earlier, of composing choral music for a particular group. But has your music been composed with a particular organist in mind? And how much would you include them in this process? I'm sure this young man, who I know actually very well, would love to be collaborating with you, and I'll put him in touch with you at some point, but that's his question.
Well, maybe I should answer those two questions that were backwards. So certainly, more or less all the organ pieces that I've done, they've definitely been written for a specific organist. And if I'm lucky, I do get time working with them actually at the keyboard of an organ. That doesn't always happen, but certainly there will be a lot of discussion, and I would definitely go along to early playthroughs and have a chat with whoever is concerned. I emphasize my lack of knowledge of how the instrument really works, so I'm really, really dependent on that kind of collaboration, but it's also very enjoyable. We talked earlier about collaborating with singers who are all different. Organists, once again, what amazing characters many of them are, and very different kinds of characters, some very quiet people, some really quite public-spirited ones. So that's part of the pleasure. Now, the other question about whether the music is written, conceived orchestrally or for a keyboard instrument. Yes, I think often both. It's so easy to answer a question and agree with both answers. But clearly, as an outsider to the organ, I have to think about it color and orchestral wise. And I would definitely say to one of my collaborative organists, oh, I'm thinking of a piece that, for instance, I have a piece called The Wild Reeds, written for Thomas Trotter. And I just remember going to him and saying, I'm so interested in reed stops, and sometimes they make horrible noises. I want to be including them. I'm really interested in the sort of, some of the stops sound, dare I say it, out of tune in the conventional sense. So it would be that kind of thing that would lead me to my first ideas. But I've also been made aware, and sometimes the organists I've written for have made me aware, that the organ is a keyboard instrument, and a particularly problematic keyboard in the sense that the keys have to be depressed or else. So very different for writing for piano. And so that's something I definitely have learned more and more to bear in mind.
And just following on, other questions come in to say, would you ever consider writing for the accordion?
Oh. Well, the accordion is a very useful modern instrument, and suddenly comes to my mind, for instance, small-scale operas. I can remember Jonathan Dove doing some brilliant accordion parts for some of his more chamber compositions. What a useful instrument, because it gives you all that color, all those notes. Again, I have to put this in my list of instruments that I know nothing about, because I've never had to write for accordion. I haven't done the work of learning about it. There are brilliant players now, real virtuosi. I see it as a very useful addition, to an ensemble. So I think it would be out of convenience rather than a musical wish so far to do it.
They're fantastically colourful instruments. I mean, they're obviously quite different to organs, but very much like an organ.
Yes, that's right.
We in fact use an accordionist to accompany quite a lot of our very small scale sort of pop-up operas that go all over the place, and he sounds like an orchestra. It's quite quite incredible. So long may the accordion last. Final questions come in, and then we might think about bringing it to a head. And you may not want to answer this one. It says, it's obviously with your Master of the Queen's Music hat on, it says, do you care about having a legacy as a composer? And have you written some things locked away in a drawer for the contingency of a new monarch? You may not be allowed to answer the last one.
Well, I have to say I will be perhaps sensible, but I have not written anything written away in a drawer. I tend to think that any piece has to be approached in the spirit of the moment, and we don't know what that spirit might be eventually. If this is a legacy as Master of the Queen's Music, again, it feels a little grandiose for a post which has lasted 400 years. I simply make my small contributions, and it's the same as anything I do. I would be thrilled if any of my music is played after I'm no longer here, or if anything that I've done in any of the schools or teaching situations, if maybe that's encouraged this or that person somewhere, I would be thrilled to hear that that is my legacy. I don't think you can plan anything greater, and as I say, would soon become a rather grandiose wish, I think, to have created something more than that.
Yeah. Now, I'm conscious we're going to draw up some time now, but actually following on the vein of the last question, it's not completely a different point. I was going to ask you just to close by perhaps if you were, this is not a desert island disc question, but if you did find yourself having to be isolated for the rest of your time, would there be one piece of yours that you would like to keep with you? And would there be one piece of another composer that you would also like to keep with you?
Well, this is something I either need a year to think about, or I'll answer just off the top of my head. At the weekend, I heard a fantastic performance of my opera Blonde Egbert on screen from Amsterdam, yeah, that's about 75 minutes of extremely energetic music. So at the moment, because that's the thing I've most recently heard, I feel I could give that quite a few more listenings. I will say during the lockdown, two composers, obvious composers, have been important to me, Bach and Beethoven. And again, just because I was talking to a colleague about this today, Bach's cantata Ein fester Burg, there was a teacher telling me that it's actually on some of the school exam syllabuses, which I thought was fantastic. And I happened in one of the churches that I'm kind of associated with in London, in the autumn, when we could do a little bit of live music, we put on a performance of Ein fester Burg, and I introduced it. And my God, what a great work that is. So I'll choose that for my work just today.
Well, I'll sit in the next door room and listen then. That would be fantastic. Well, Judith, thank you so much. It's been lovely to speak with you and to hear so many wonderful insights and thoughts. And I hope that's been the same for. I know if we've had lots of messages saying how enjoyable people have been finding this conversation. Well, you anyway, particularly, I think. So I think we might say thank you very much. David, I don't know whether you want to come back in with us at all.
Well, very briefly,
just here we are.
Just to thank you both. An hour has absolutely flown by, and it's so fascinating to hear. I know, obviously, I'm an organist, but I'm always pleased to hear about non-organ music and to hear about operas and all your influences. I think it's just been wonderful. So thank you both, and Richard, for steering things through so smoothly and eloquently, and Judith for giving your time so generously. And it's just wonderful to hear.
David, it can't be easier when you've got someone like Judith to talk to.
No, it's wonderful to have you both.
A pleasure for me too. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess just to say, you mentioned the Organ Festival kindly earlier. Our main features every Monday. We've got a streamed recital coming up actually on Monday. My colleague Tom Leach is playing live from Leeds Cathedral. That's 1:15. Other weeks we've had to have some of our foreign friends have sent in pre-records or videos, and we're also doing a podcast series. And I do wonder whether we might ask you nicely whether this could go out as a podcast. It's much better than me chunching away less eloquently than Richard does. But thank you so much for your time both. We've had a fascinating evening.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
David.
Okay.
And thank you for joining us. We
much.
can't see you all here, but thank you, our participants, for coming and joining us tonight, and hoping you're all staying safe and well. And please do look at our website and join us for the other events coming up for the rest of the festival. So I'll say again, thank you very much. Lovely to see you both, and take care. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Good night.
Indeed, and
Bye-bye.
goodbye.
Bye, Judith. Bye-bye.